of the shadows, bound for the gallows, a dead man walking, till love came calling. Rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. 6 feet under, I thought it was over, and answered a prayer, the voice of a savior. Rise up, rise up, rise up, rise up. All at once I came alive. This beating heart, these open eyes, the grave let go, the darkness should have known. You're still rolling strong. You're still rolling, rolling on. You're still rolling strong.
Welcome. Really glad that you're joining us again this week online. If it's your very first time, my name is Joel and I am one of the pastors here at the church. You know, it's great to be able to connect with people online, but I also want to let you know that we're also meeting in person every Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Listen, you can show up a little bit early. Coffee's on and ready to go at about 10 o'clock. You can enjoy coffee before, you can enjoy coffee during. Heck, you can even hang around and enjoy coffee afterwards. And so if you want to come, you want to show up, we are in person. We provide a full kids ministry as well. It would be great to be able to connect with you. This week, you're going to notice a little bit of a common theme in terms of what I'm wearing. Some of our For Paris swag. Actually, if you would like to get some of this, you can just simply send me an email and I'll hook you up with Leah and she'll be able to connect with you. But For Paris is a part of who we are as a church. It reminds us that we want to be a church that is for our community, that we want to be generous in terms of everything that we do. Generosity is going to be a theme that I'm going to pick up a little later on today in the message. But how does it look like for us as For Paris? I was reminded of this again this week, that we were For Paris by supporting families in our community this week, providing them gift cards to buy food and to buy clothing. I was reminded of how we are For Paris when I walk downstairs and I smell the amazing aroma of the raw carrot cooking amazing soup. The Raw Carrot is a vital ministry of our church that helps provide meaningful employment for people who are on disability. Being For Paris means that we allow our building to be used by the community. If you drive by our church, you'll notice the scaffolding. You'll notice all the work that's also going inside. And I hope you understand that we're doing all this not just simply for our benefit, but so that we can have a building that is for our community, so that community groups can meet, so that we can provide concerts in our sanctuary, so that local theater can have a home to perform. And the list could go on and on and on. Being For Paris means that we are for our community, which means we look at the things that we have as being a means to help others. And that means that we need to be generous. And so really glad that you are joining us online. We'd love to be able to connect with you in person, but if that's not possible for a variety of reasons, we'd love to continue to connect with you online. And so just simply shoot me an email. Let me know where you're watching, who you're watching with. If you have a question, if you have a comment, if you have something that maybe you just want to run by someone, I would love to hear from you. We will respond to you and connect with you as best we can. Because remember, we want to be for you. We want to get in your corner and support you and encourage you in any way that we can. And so that's why we do online, knowing that even though people can't be in person, we can still connect in this way. Well, I'm glad you're watching. Today we're talking about generosity. And I hope that it provides an opportunity for you to think, how can you continue to be generous in your life as well? And so we're going to jump into some music and then the message, and then hopefully this entire service is of benefit to you. Appreciate you joining in.
I believe in the blood of Jesus that washes white as snow. I believe in the power of the gospel still makes the broken whole. I believe that the curse of sin is broken generation. Look at what the Lord has done. Sing it to the darkness that the light has come. Sing it to the nations. Look at what the Lord has done. Sing it to the daughter. Sing it to the son. To every generation. Look at what the Lord has done. Sing it to the darkness that the light has come. Sing it to the nation. Look at what the Lord has done. Look at what the Lord has done. As I bow before you, Lord, I will arise in confidence. I will see your goodness, Lord, in the land I'm living in. And no matter where I go, and no matter where I've been, I will see your goodness, Lord, in the land I'm living in. As I bow before you, Lord, I will rise in confidence. I will see your goodness, Lord, in the land I'm living in. And no matter where I go, and no matter where I've been, I will see your goodness, Lord, in the land I'm living in.
So you're likely probably wondering, what is the deal with the gas can, with the fuel can? Um, so I'm no expert when it comes to vehicles, but I know this. If I want my cars to run, I need fuel in their tank. That I can want my car to drive and I want to go many places and do many things, but without fuel, it's just going to stay put. So you probably didn't start watching this because you wanted some tips on fuel and the importance of them in cars. We get that. But what I hope is that this begins to provide a bit of an image, a bit of a mental picture for us when it comes to generosity. Let me ask you a question. What is it in your life that fuels your generosity? Because I'm sure for all of us, we all want to be generous. I mean, nobody wants to be Scrooge or the Grinch. Listen, I apologize if Christmas references are a little bit too early, but we all want to be generous. And sometimes we may lament the fact that we're not as generous as we'd want to be. And so back to the question, what is it that fuels your generosity? I think sometimes our generosity is fueled by the needs that we see. We see someone in need, or we see a specific need, and we want to give. That's why we give to things like the food bank, or we give to the Red Cross, or we see disasters around the world, and we want to give and we want to help. We want to be generous. Other times we may give because we are fueled by our emotions, both positively and negatively. I mean, let's be honest, we can be generous because it makes us feel good. Like when we give and when we help, we feel better about ourselves, and that's a good thing. On the flip side, sometimes we may give because we feel guilty. We think, I have so much, others have so little, I most certainly should give. But is that the baseline? I mean, is there something more? Does our generosity get reduced to what I would refer to as situational giving? That we give or we are generous based upon how we feel or based upon a need before us? Or is there something greater? If you've been with us this fall, we have been working through a series called Essentials, and it's a series that has been looking at what are some of the key essentials when it comes to being a follower of Jesus. What are the essentials for us to believe? What are the essentials for us to behave? And we've gone back and begun to look at the early church. This period of time, this pivotal time, that following Jesus' death and then resurrection, these disciples began to carry the movement of Jesus. And it's here that we begin to see some of the essentials for them, to hopefully act as a reminder for us. And today, I want to look at how giving, how generosity is essential. That if you begin to look at the early church, you see how incredibly generous these individuals were. And so what was it? What was it that fueled their generosity? Was it just how it made them feel? Was it just the situations before them? Or was there something greater going on? Well, to help us unpack it here today and hopefully become more meaningful for us as well, regardless of where you land when it comes to faith, I want to turn to a portion of the Bible in the New Testament, the book of 2 Corinthians. Now, if you're not familiar with the Bible, the last half of the Bible, the New Testament, begins by talking about Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection, his ministry. And then the last part of it deals with the movement of the early church. And what we see a lot in the New Testament are these small little letters or books that are given. And essentially, it's written by leaders of the early church, inspired by God, to address these growing Christian communities around issues, around questions, around problems that they are dealing with. And so today we're going to look at a portion of one of those letters in 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Now, the background to this is there is a severe famine in Jerusalem. So the very beginning of where the Jesus movement began, things are not going well. And so the Apostle Paul, one of the great leaders of the early church, is basically going to other Christian communities and is asking them, will you give, will you be generous to these fellow brothers and sisters that are struggling in Jerusalem? And what I like about this particular section of this letter is the context. Because Paul is dealing with some of the barriers at times to generosity. I mean, I don't know about you, but when I think about generosity, I don't only think about what fuels my generosity, but what are some of the barriers that I need to step beyond? I mean, sometimes it's the barriers of personal circumstances. Sometimes it's the barriers of the difficulties that I am facing in life. So sometimes the barriers are just wondering, will I have enough? Like if I give this away, will I have enough for me? Sometimes it's the barriers of like, listen, I just don't want to make the sacrifice. I kind of like the things I have and I want to get more. And so if I am generous, will that mean there is less for me? That's why I find these words of the Apostle Paul so helpful, not just simply for the content, but for the tone as well. And so let's jump into what Paul has to say, understand the context, and then start to unpack it so that we have a better understanding of how can we step beyond just situational generosity, being generous just because of the need we see or how it makes us feel, and begin to see it as all-encompassing for all of life. So we're going to turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 8, beginning with verse 1. And this is what Paul says to all of us. He says, "Now I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, about the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. They are being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they're also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave not only what they could afford, but far more. They did it of their own free will. They begged us again and again for the privilege of sharing in the gift of the believers in Jerusalem. They did even more than we had hoped, for their first action was to give themselves to the Lord and to us, just as God wanted them to do. So we have urged Titus, who encouraged your giving in the first place, to return to you and encourage you to finish this ministry of giving. Since you excel in so many ways, in your faith, your gifted speakers, your knowledge, your enthusiasm, and your love from us, I want you to also excel in the gracious act of giving. I'm not commanding you to do this, but I'm testing how genuine your love is by comparing it with the eagerness of the other churches. You know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich." You see, the circumstance is this, is that Paul is writing a letter to the Christians in Corinth, reminding them of how they had promised to be generous, how they wanted to be generous, but they failed to act upon the words they spoke. And so what Paul is doing is he's encouraging them through the example of the Macedonian churches, a group of churches that the circumstances are rather interesting, that we're told that they were facing severe trials, they were poor,
Yet they welled up in great joy and they were rich in generosity. I love how Paul says over and over again that they gave exceedingly more than even he had expected, that they actually begged to be even more generous. They wanted to continue to give, to continue to give, to continue to give. And so what was it? What was it that fueled the Macedonian churches that even beyond their own circumstances, even in a situation where it seemed as if they couldn't give, they were incredibly generous? What was it? Two key phrases that begin to help us unpack what their fuel for generosity was. The first one is when Paul begins, he says, I want to talk to you about the grace that God has given. And then he says, towards the middle, their first action was to give themselves to the Lord. I believe the Macedonian churches excelled in generosity, were able to step beyond just situational giving because their fuel for generosity was not just the need, was not just simply how they felt. It was fueled by their faith. It was the grace that God had given them. You see, for the Macedonians, for these early Christians, their generosity was fueled as a response to what God had done for them. Did it make them feel good? Absolutely. It says they welled up in joy. Did they see the need? Most certainly. But at the end of the day, they were able to step beyond and give amazingly and graciously and generously because their generosity was fueled by their faith. They were able to give in an incredible way. As you start to think about generosity in the Bible, you begin to see that the generosity is not just about recognizing a need. It's not just about how it makes us feel, but it can become an act of worship. And maybe you've been at a church and you've seen them take up the offering or they talk about giving and you think, okay, yeah, it's going to help people in need and yeah, it's going to run the ministries of the church, but you don't really think it beyond that. Have you ever considered of how our giving becomes an act of worship? If you jump back into the Old Testament, I'm not sure how familiar you were, but when people would give to the temple, the gifts would be used for three primary things. The first is a portion would be used to help people in need. That makes sense. Another portion was given to the priests because they didn't have land, they had no means of income, so it supported the ministry that they were doing. Okay, you can get behind that. But then the portion was taken, and oftentimes the best portion was taken, and they burnt it on the altar. Totally consumed it. Like a modern day context is imagine the gift that you give to the church. A portion goes to help people in need. A portion goes to support the ministries of the church. And then I just kind of gathered up the offerings and I put them in a big can and I dumped gasoline on it and I just torched the place. Like, what would you think? You'd be like, what is this guy doing? Like, I didn't give you the money so that you could burn it. Like, it could have been used to help other people in need. But take a step back and begin to understand that this was an act of worship. That there's this phrase that they use that when they would burn the offerings, it was like a fragrant aroma going up into the heavens. It speaks to the fact that generosity ultimately steps beyond just the need, steps beyond just how it makes us feel, and becomes an act of worship. I love how the Christians in Macedonia, it says they gave first to the Lord. It wasn't they gave first to the people in Jerusalem. They recognized that their gift was a means to give first to God. You know what happens? When we allow our generosity to be fueled by more than just how it makes us feel, or by more than just the needs we see, it will exceed expectations. That's exactly what began to happen for the Christians in Macedonia. Paul ends this comment by saying this. He says, "For you know the generous grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty he could make you rich." Generosity, I believe, ultimately, if we want to get beyond situational giving, has to flow out of this belief that our generosity is fueled by the grace of God. that our generosity is an act of worship, that it becomes a response to what Jesus has done and forgiven to us. Because I'm sure you know this, God doesn't need our stuff. He wants our hearts. And the problem is that if we just simply give to situations or how it makes us feel, we may give, but God doesn't capture our heart. But I love the tone of this letter, because Paul at the very end reminds them, listen, I am not commanding you. Paul has taken the guilt card right out. He's like, this isn't about me making you feel guilty. And sometimes maybe you've been in a church and you're like, okay, I'm going to give because I feel guilty. I don't really want to. And Paul's like, I'm not commanding you. I'm just reminding you that here's an opportunity to show your love for Jesus. You see, when our generosity is fueled by grace, when it's fueled by a response given to God, our generosity begins to exceed our expectations. We'll begin to give in a way that we would have never expected or even thought possible at the beginning. But it also becomes a lifestyle. That's something when we become generous because of the grace that God has given us, it becomes more than just what we give financially. It's, are we generous with our time? Are we generous with our attitude? Are we generous towards people when it comes to forgiveness? Listen, there's many reasons why we give. We may see a need and we want to give, and that's amazing. We may give because of how it makes us feel, both good or bad, and that also can be positive. But if we truly want to excel in the grace of giving, if generosity wants to become more of who we are and not just simply something we do, it needs to be fueled by the grace of God. By recognizing first and foremost what Jesus has done for you and what Jesus has done for me. Because when we do this, it begins to have an impact, not just only on us, but on others as well. As we jump further down this letter in chapter 9, this is what Paul says. He says, this service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of God's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. What Paul is saying is that when we step beyond and when we allow the grace of God to fuel our generosity, it's absolutely going to help those in need, but it's going to create something even greater. And that is an opportunity for people to express their thanks to God. Let me ask you, do people notice generosity in your life? As a church, when we talk about being for Paris, it's about wanting to be generous. It's about wanting to use our stuff. It's about wanting to use our time. It's about wanting to use our resources for the benefit of others, not simply because of the needs we see, not just simply because of how it makes us feel, but because it is an act of grace and worship. That we see what we have as an opportunity to give because of what God has given to us in Jesus. So how do we respond? Maybe for some of you, it's a place today to recognize the incredible gift that Jesus has given to you, and to begin to accept this gift and to live out of this gift, and to realize this gift goes beyond our understanding. And then from there, we begin to see everything that we do as a response to Jesus and the grace that he has given us. The second thing is, let us be intentional about it. You see, Paul wrote this letter because the Corinthians wanted to be generous, but they failed to be generous. They spoke about it, but they didn't act upon it. Sometimes we can do the same. I know sometimes I can do the same. I can allow my own present circumstances to weigh down my desire to be generous. And one of the ways that I cultivate generosity is that I am intentional about it. that I step beyond just the situation. I step beyond just how it makes me feel or the needs I see. I see it as an act of worship. And so in the very same way that I want to pray regularly and I want to read my Bible regularly and I want to come to church and worship with others regularly, I want to give regularly as well, in a generous, sacrificial manner, so that my giving becomes an act of worship. What about you? What intentional step can you take today that you can be generous? Perhaps it begins by looking to Jesus and seeing how even though he was rich, he became poor for your sake. That our response is always in recognizing what Jesus has done for us, and then we give as an act of worship. Listen, when you're generous, you not only will benefit people, it will not only make you feel good, but people will see what you're doing, and it will make them wonder more about who God is in your life. And that's a position we want to be in. This week, think about what fuels your generosity, and how can faith begin to influence all that you do. Let me pray. So gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for examples like the churches in Macedonia thousands of years ago, that even though they were in difficult times, facing challenges, they were still incredibly generous. May we be the same. God, may we look at our lives as an opportunity to give back to you. May we see the needs in our community and be generous. But may our generosity ultimately be fueled by the grace that you have given to us. For we ask it, Jesus, in your name. Amen. So now may the Lord bless you and keep you. Now may the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious toward you. Now may the Lord look to you always and grant you his peace and his grace, today and in all of your tomorrows. Amen.
Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Oh, the mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me.